Hello everybody, you're listening to the Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host Dane Cobain. This is the weekly radio show where we chat about the local arts news. We have a different guest on each week. We head over to the Rhylight Zone for a short story and or some poetry. And we catch up with Twangling Jack Ford over in the Oak Shed for a weekly album review. We have started some announcements recently, so if you would like to share any news that you've got, do let me know. You can also drop me MP3s or inquire about becoming a guest. All of that, just drop me a line on dane.cobain@wickhamsound.org.uk. That's dane.cobain@wickhamsound.org.uk. And I'm particularly keen to hear from poets, performers, musicians, people with MP3s, local arts news, all of that jazz. Get in touch. You can also find us on Facebook. If you search for The Art Show on Wickham Sound, you should be able to find us. And we are repeated on Wickham Sound on Monday nights. We're on the Wickham Sound Listen Again, iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Please do leave us a short review on your podcast platform of choice. So this week we're going to be doing a Twangling Jack Ford album review special, but before we get started with that, let's have some announcements. 60 years, one incredible challenge. Bob Yates runs the length of Britain for charity. Local handicross runner Bob Yates is celebrating his 60th year in a way most wouldn't dare, by running the entire length of Britain. Starting on May 31st, Bob will take on the legendary Land's End to John O'Groats challenge, covering 1,000 miles over 5 grueling weeks. But Bob isn't just running for the thrill, he's doing it to support Humanity Direct, a charity that provides life-changing medical care for underprivileged children worldwide. Every step he takes brings hope to children who desperately need it. Follow Bob's journey and support his incredible mission at humanitydirect.org/Bob. Let's cheer him on as he pushes his limits for an amazing cause. Alright, those were this week's announcements, and we're going to head straight into the Rhylight Zone. And what are we doing today? We're doing a new part one of a new short story by myself, Dane Cobain, and this is going to be The Ranch. The ranch was on the outskirts of a little village that was lost in the middle of the countryside. The nearest town, which Bellina had to cycle to and from during term time, was 5 or 6 miles away. But that didn't bother the teenager. She hated the hustle and bustle of the big cities and felt much more at ease with animals than with people. Still, there were 1 or 2 people who'd broken through her outer reserve and found a special place in her heart. There was Grandpa Borgie, who she loved more than she loved life itself, and there was her mother and father, as well as a couple of aunts, uncles and cousins. She also had a couple of best friends, Michaela and Michael, who happened to be twins. Perhaps that was why she got on with them so well, because she got 2 for the price of 1. She'd always found it difficult to socialise, but when she spent time with the Andreezy twins, there was much less pressure. They were basically the same person, and if she ever went silent, then they'd happily carry a conversation between themselves. The Andreezy twins were keen riders too, partly because their uncle Alphonse had taken sole ownership of the ranch after Grandpa Borgie's retirement. Much to Bellina's jealousy, Michaela and Michael both lived on the ranch, along with most of the other Andreezys, and they didn't even have to work to earn their keep. The Andreezys had a little sister called Amelia, but she'd only just turned 4 and so she wasn't allowed to play with them. That worked just fine for Bellina. 2 of them were more than enough. For Bellina and her friends, life was for living, and there was no form of living quite like there was during the summer holidays. The Italians had 3 months off school during the summer, which meant 3 months of riding every day, and there was one summer in particular that Bellina would remember for the rest of her life. Most of her days followed a similar routine. She'd start at dawn, working on and off until taking an early lunch, which usually consisted of bread and butter washed down with a glass of milk and occasionally chased with a pastry or 2, if there were any. Then she'd meet the Andreezy twins at around 1, and the trio would spend the rest of the day with the horses. That fateful summer was hotter than most, which meant that the ranch seemed more like a ghost town in the American Wild West. True, the summer had been a busy one, and they'd had no shortage of tourists, even in the small village in the middle of the countryside, but they mostly rode in the mornings. The afternoons were too hot, even for Bellina. And so the 3 of them spent most afternoons indoors, locking themselves in the saddlery and surrounding themselves with the scent of wood, oil and leather. The barn wasn't big enough for the horses, although it was occasionally used to store food and hay. Small, dark and dingy, full of cobwebs and rusted machinery, it had a small loft up top that could be reached by climbing a rickety wooden ladder that had seen better days. In fact, the building was the oldest one on the premises, predating the rest of the ranch by a good 50 years, if not more. It had once been a farmhouse, but then a newer replacement had been built and then the farm had turned into a ranch, leaving the crappy old building surplus to requirements. It had been used as a stable for cows for a while, but it was too small to house more than 3 or 4 of them, and it had eventually been moved to a larger barn, which had since been converted to the main stables. Most of the adults had forgotten that the building was there. Whenever they did think about it, it was only in passing as they told themselves that they really ought to have the damn thing pulled down. That made it the perfect place for the 3 kids when it was too hot to be outside and they didn't want to be disturbed by killing time back at the Andreezy house. Michael and Dreezy was deathly afraid of the paranormal, and so whenever the three of them gathered to chat and tell stories, there was an unwritten rule that ghost stories were off the table. That suited the two girls just fine, and most of their tall tales took the form of epic fantasies. They threw in the occasional battle to keep Michael entertained, but they mostly revolved around elves riding horses from one forest to another. That was the first instalment of The Ranch by myself, Dane Cobain, for this week's entry into the Rhylight Zone. You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound, and this is Straight 8 with their version of Sweet Soul Music.
Piggy now, singing Mustangs out there. Oh yeah, spotlight is on, it's ready now. Singing fine, 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 fine. Singing fine, 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 fine. Oh yeah,
the moon shining in the darkest skies. mother to children of a Holy Land, priestess, warrior of the Sacred Heart, mistress to Cobain's life. She rode the storms from a winged isle, through the valley hill her heart beats. Ever is a storm, and ever is the wind.
That was Aoife by Andrew Hoger, and before that we had Sweet Soul Music by Straight 8. You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain, and it's time for me to hand over now to Twangling Jack Ford over in the Oak Shed for some weekly album reviews.
Argent, the best of Argent, an LP I got from the vinyl sale at the Wickham Arts Centre for a £5. Argent were both an early 70s heavy band with serious improvised solos, and also quite commercial with two songwriters. I first heard them when Hold Your Head Up was a hit single and they appeared on Top of the Pops. Rod Argent had been the keyboard player and the main songwriter in the Zombies. He was responsible for the songs Time of the Season and She's Not There. He was also seriously good at playing the Hammond organ. His solos had that same rock-stroke-classical mix as Keith Emerson. The singer-stroke-guitarist-stroke-other songwriter was Russ Ballard, a man who always looked cool in black shades. He always looked like the band should have been called Ballard. Russ Ballard, along with the Argent drummer Bob Henrit, had been in Unit 4+2, a 60s pop band who had a big hit with Concrete and Clay. Ballard wrote many of the Argent songs, and later wrote for other acts. His biggest writing hit is probably Since You've Been Gone, which was recorded by Rainbow. I have an Argent compilation CD, which has always sounded quite disappointing. But this LP, with fewer but many of the same tracks, sounds really good. I had never noticed before how good their harmony singing was. I had never heard the song Pleasure before. It is not on the CD. It has a touch of the Beach Boys' Surf's Up era to it. I definitely remember the songs Liar and It's Only Money, and even though I never like mentions of deities, I am very partial to God Gave Rock and Roll to You, which, unlike the more famous Kiss cover, Argent perform as a mini prog rock suite. Great songs, great singing and great organ playing. The best of Argent. Badfinger, Timeless, The Musical Legacy. Badfinger had 3 great hit singles in the early 70s that brightened up a fairly dull hit parade. I remember hearing them on the radio and thinking they sounded like the Beatles. Everyone thought they sounded like the Beatles. They were on the Beatles record label. Their first hit was a very catchy number called Come and Get It, and it was famous for having been written and produced by Paul McCartney. I thought no matter what, the second single, even though it was written by Badfinger, actually sounded even more like the Beatles. I remember being very impressed by their third hit, Day After Day. It was not quite so Beatlesque, though the slide guitar did make it sound a bit like a George Harrison solo song. And George Harrison did actually produce Day After Day. It was said at the time that Badfinger was sort of apprentice Beatles. It was speculated that maybe the Fab Four were beyond doing the real graft and had taken on some trainees to do the hard work for them. Members of Badfinger would often turn up on projects by each of the Beatles and were even named after a bad finger that had caused John Lennon problems while trying to play the piano on With a Little Help from My Friends. It seemed at the time that the Beatles connection was a big plus for Badfinger, but it meant that they were caught up in the legal problems and general chaos brought about by the Beatles split. There was a fourth hit single in the States that was not released in the UK. The song was called Baby Blue, And it was a song that was equal to the other hits, but only gained a UK chart entry after it was played in the last episode of Breaking Bad. This CD has the single they recorded as the Ivies before they changed their name, a really effective power ballad called Maybe Tomorrow. Listening to this CD, those early songs sound a bit underproduced. The guitars are distorted, possibly to make them sound a bit like the heavy bands of the time, but they do not have the powerful distortion of Iommi or Townsend, but an emptier sound suggesting fuzz boxes, or by overloading the desk, rather like the lead on the Beatles' Revolution, the Hey Jude B-side version. Amongst these early tracks is their original version of Without You. It does not particularly stand out, and it was very astute of Harry Nilsson to spot it and make it a worldwide hit. The later tracks are much better produced and they should have been more successful, but even after escaping the Beatles' chaos, they managed to become embroiled in even more legal issues. The two songwriters of Without You never got the money they were owed, and both of them committed suicide, one in the 70s and the other in the 80s, so neither saw the massive hit that Mariah Carey had with their song. Badfinger, the musical legacy. Bebop Deluxe, Futurama. I seem to have lost my Bebop Deluxe compilation CD that I've had for years, so I bought this second-hand LP from the record shop in Amersham, and I have fallen in love with it. It just seems to have everything. In the mid-70s, Bebop Deluxe looked like they were no longer glam, but you could see where it had been. They were a vehicle for the songwriting, singing, and lightning-fast guitar work of Bill Nelson. The songs were a bit Bowie and a bit Cockney Rebel, and there had been some Cockney Rebels amongst the ever-changing Bebop Deluxe lineup. They were not actually bebop, there was nothing Charlie Parker about them, though maybe they were influenced by Mark Bolan's fondness for the term, as in Bebop Moon and Bebop Baby the Dance is Where It's At. I had not heard anyone like Bill Nelson at the time. He was a bit like Steve Howe meets Brian May with a touch of Alvin Lee. He was impressively fast before the shredders made it quite commonplace. I am always amazed to see a local guitarist cover one of the Bebop Deluxe songs. Tony Dubinsky, a regular at the Wickham Jams, plays Ships in the Night, a song that gave up little in the way of musical inventiveness in order to make it quite radio-friendly and a minor hit. This album has the song Made in Heaven, which is equally tricky yet quite catchy. Most of the tracks are like complex prog rock epics that have been summarised into bite-sized pieces. They can sound a bit cluttered, with ideas coming thick and fast, leaving little time for the listener to settle into something, only for it to be replaced by something totally different. It can be both frustrating and exhilarating. The first track hits the ground running with a vortex of swirling guitars and hints of a bolero, and I do love a bolero. Frantic changes in style come and go throughout this album, with even some psychedelic phasing, and I do like a bit of phasing. I was hearing all this back in 1975, back when progressive rock had become ponderous, and while pub rock bands were injecting new energy into the music scene. While Bebop Deluxe could do Queen-like pomp and vaudeville, they also had the energy of the coming era, the exhilarating choruses, that tendency to incorporate funk, bossa nova and reggae, and the spirit of independence that had seen them originally release material on their own record label. They were pioneers of the do-it-yourself and indie ethos. Futurama, Bebop Deluxe. Bert Jansch, Rosemary Lane. I found a batch of used vinyl in the Sue Ryder charity shop in Wickham. They were all priced at £1. I was very tempted to buy all of them, but in the end, as a matter of principle, I only bought the ones I knew I would play. This one seems to go for about £16 on the second-hand market. I knew I would play it at least once because Bert Jansch is a legend and is due a certain amount of homage. I am familiar with Bert Jansch, A friend of mine set up the 12 Bar Club in Denmark Street, and Jansch was booked to play the opening night. I was in the VIP area, which was just a few feet away from him. I got a clear view of his complex but rock-solid guitar picking, and his subdued melancholic but melodic singing. I was greatly impressed, though not necessarily very entertained. I do enjoy his work with Pentangle, but everyone else in that ensemble each brought something important to the mix. I was surprised how listenable a record of his solo singing and playing could be. Jansch was a great influence on his guitarist contemporaries in the 60s music scene. Wikipedia claims that he shared a flat in Kilburn with Roy Harper and Paul Simon. A well-known example of his influence is the track Black Waterside. Jansch's arrangement of the piece is very similar to a piece played by Jimmy Page on Led Zeppelin 1, for which many believe Jansch should have got a credit. This 1971 recording is very clear, and you can perfectly hear the fingers plucking the strings. Musically, it is much more interesting than standard folk, using modal scales and odd time signatures, but the singing to me sounds very much old-style folk club. Though Jansch was from Glasgow, to me it all sounds quite northern, not in an Andy Capp Coronation Street way, but more a dour, bearded, hill-walking, Kendall mint cake eating geography teachers hold up in a pub with real horse brasses, real ale and a real wet dog by a smoky fire kind of way. Bert Jansch, Rosemary Lane. Carole King, Tapestry, a CD I bought for £2 from the British Heart Foundation shop in High Wycombe. This album represents possibly the pinnacle of the early 70s singer-songwriter albums. It was a time when solo acts would sing and accompany themselves, as if performing a live solo gig with only a few other instruments accompanying the accompaniment, and very much in the background. This would have been true for albums by Cat Stevens, James Taylor, and Elton John. Later singer-songwriter albums would sound more like a band. Someone like Billy Joel would have his piano mixed more equally with the other instruments, but Carole King's piano was like a complete band in its own right. It was not at all tinkly, prissy or over-ornate. It stated the rhythm which the bass and drums follow. It often has a particular groove, not funky but definitely possessing soul. She even provides percussive fills. Her singing is not the kind of singing that wins competitions. There is nothing unnecessary about it. She is not trying to better the song because the songs are hers, and she is doing what is best for them. A good example is the song It's Too Late. There is film of her playing all that needs playing with just a guitarist. I think the lyric lacks the kind of inspiration that characterised the song she wrote with her ex-husband, but it has a strong, memorable melody and a piano part that includes instrumental flourishes that on a bigger production could have been strings or horns. The version on this album has a jazzy sax. The CD has a live bonus track that shows how much of a self-contained artist she was. The album starts with Feel the Earth Move, which has a soulful vocal melody and blues licks on the piano. Carole King was previously best known not as a performer, but as a songwriter of hits for other acts. Along with her husband Jerry Goffin, she wrote some of my all-time favourite 60s pop songs. Pop, but also quality. Songs like Going Back, Pleasant Valley Sunday, and Halfway to Paradise, though they may now be more famous for their song The Locomotion. This album is all about the songs, from a time when people wanted to hear good songs rather than just good singing. The song, Way Over Yonder, sees her writing, playing and singing a very authentic sounding gospel song. This album may seem to have the smooth sound of that times, that LA gloss, but also she has some New York grit. Her voice can seem fragile and hesitant. Her rendition of You're As Beautiful As You Feel does not sound like she is convinced that she is. Many of these songs have been covered, and I possibly prefer James Taylor's You've Got a Friend, or Aretha Franklin's You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman. I possibly even prefer the teenage Carole King's original version of Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow. Call me sentimental, but I especially love the original string arrangement. I think the original Goffin King Will You Still Love Me is a perfect song and must have set them a very high bar. Tapestry, Carole King.
You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain. We have been over in the Oak Shed with Twangling Jack Ford for some of his weekly album reviews. And this is Jessica Williamson with Turning Point. That was Turning Point by Jessica Williamson. You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain, and it's time for us to head back into the Ilkshed now to catch up with Twangling Jack Ford for some of this week's weekly album review.
Focus, Moving Waves, an LP I bought for a £5 from the vinyl sale at Wickham Arts Centre. Only a few times in my life have I heard something totally extraordinary. Possibly hearing Born to Run for the first time, or New Rose, or Paranoid Android. I am sure I heard Hocus Pocus by Focus on the radio before they played it on the Old Grey Whistle Test. But after they played it on the Old Grey Whistle Test, it was all anybody could talk about next day in the morning break at school, and I presume out in the real world. Adding to the interest was the fact that Focus were Dutch. Being European was a novelty at the time, even though we would all become European a few years later. I borrowed a copy of this album and I taped it and I played it many times, but I only really remembered the track Hocus Pocus. I have a Focus compilation CD, and Hocus Pocus outshines all the other tracks, good as they are. It is prog rock's anarchy in the UK. It starts with a riff that blows away 90% of hard rock riffs. It is fast and furious and builds to screaming climaxes that go way over the top. It has screeching guitar and a Jethro Tull-like flute. But all of that is overshadowed by the yodeling. Yes, yodeling. It was a hit hard-rocking prog rock instrumental with yodeling. It also has a bit that sounds like a sped-up clip from the Goons Ying Tong song. I have heard it on the radio, on TV, on my childhood record player, on cassette and on CD. But I played this LP nice and loud and it almost threw me back in my chair. The rest of the album has plenty of melodies and expert playing. There is a classical guitar piece backed by Mellotron, and there is one track with actual real singing on it. It sounds like a solo recital piece with rippling piano accompaniment. But it is the side-long epic on side 2 which is the other standout moment. It is called Eruption. It is more like a classical piece than many of the other side-long prog epics of the time, which tended to be just extended songs or medleys of songs and instrumentals. Chas Van Leer's keyboards are romantic classical, a bit like Keith Emerson's work with the Nice. Jan Akkerman, the guitarist, has a fluid sense of melody that also comes across as very European. He also does a thing many electric guitarists do by turning up the volume as they play a note to make it sound like bowed strings. Ackerman's standout section has the tone and feel of a European Santana. Focus later had another hit with another instrumental called Sylvia that was pretty much a Jan Ackerman solo piece. Elsewhere in the track Eruption, we get choral sections including monastic chanting. A good old rock and roll workout with some biting modal scale moments, a textbook Hammond organ solo, a pastoral flute movement, and a drum solo that manages to avoid being tedious. The album flirts with all kinds of musical styles, but nothing seems like it has been forced into place to placate egos. I saw Focus at Wickham Arts Centre. Chas Van Leer was very much the star of the show. They also had the original drummer, Pierre Van Linden. The drum solo got almost as big a cheer as the yodeling. The guitarist did a very good job in recreating Jan Ackerman's guitar parts. Having not heard most of this album since it came out, I was surprised how undated it sounds. Probably because, as the early Queen albums boasted, no one played synths. Moving Waves. Focus. The Very Best of Jackson Browne, a double CD I picked up in a library sale. Often singer-songwriters who write on guitar will substitute melody for nuance, not singing pure notes but splitting syllables with semi-improvised ornamentation. I have always assumed that Jackson Browne composed on a piano. I know from my own experience that on a piano your fingers can find the melody before you give it to your voice. You can tinkle around finding melodies with the right hand while trying out the chords with the left. Jackson Browne is known for his songwriting, and he seems to have a lot of respect for both his own songs and the cover songs he performs. He has a good singing voice, but it is all about the song. He faithfully keeps to the melody with minimal vocal gymnastics. The early songs on this chronological album were successfully covered by other artists, notably Doctor My Eyes by the Jacksons and Taking It Easy by Eagles. There is a great song called These Days which was covered by Nico. I like these songs, but I do not much like the recordings. I used to have a live album by Southside Johnny and the Asbury Dukes. It featured a part where they start to play the song Taking It Easy, using some insipid Eagles-type guitar strumming, only to then show how they do it on the East Coast, when the band come thundering in with some high-octane brass-driven soul rock. Jackson Browne's version of Taking It Easy actually has some pedal steel guitar, which is always a red flag for me. I admire the Jackson Browne classic The Pretender, but I know I would have liked it much more had it been recorded by the E Street Band rather than some laid-back LA session musicians. The first CD ends with the only song sung by Jackson Browne that I can remember being a hit. It comes after a song which has him celebrating his road crew and asking them to take his piano away last in case he might want to continue playing it. This then ends with his cover of the song Stay. It was an odd single because without the song before it there is no explanation as to why he's singing about roadies and unions. Anyone of my age will remember it, especially the falsetto chorus. The second CD starts with another of his classic songs, Running on Empty. The songs on the second CD have more oomph, more Billy Joel. They flirt with 80s production but are not brought down by it. There is the insanely catchy Somebody's Baby and some cutting cynicism in tracks like Lawyers in Love. However, the high point for me was the only other cover, the song called I Am a Patriot, a song written by Steve Van Zandt, who is Bruce Springsteen's best friend and guitarist, leader of Little Steven and the Disciples of Soul, and Silvio Dante in The Sopranos, and one of my heroes. It tells how liberals can also be patriots. The very best of Jackson Browne. Joe Walsh solo and with the James Gang, 1969 to 1974. This is a very cheap compilation CD and it was cheap enough for me to buy it just out of interest. I remembered Joe Walsh's song Rocky Mountain Way from when it came out. It is a big bluesy hard rocking boogie shuffle epic with thumping piano and voice box. It has Joe Walsh's signature high-pitched raspy voice, his harsh aggressive guitar lead and chord work and slide soloing. It has a big catchy melody. It used to get played on Nicky Horn's Your Mother Wouldn't Like It early evening rock show on Capital Radio, and on Alan Fluff Freeman's Saturday rock show on Wonderful Radio 1. I also remember Life's Been Good to Me So Far, his amusing hard rock reggae-ish hit, but it is not on this CD that only goes up to 1974. I must have heard others of his songs because I remember he had a band called Barnstorm and a couple of interestingly titled albums, so I was surprised when he joined the Eagles, though the first Eagles release with Joe Walsh was Life in the Fast Lane, that does sound very Joe Walsh. I was surprised by the variety on this album. Much of it is his first band, the James Gang, which I thought was a standard early 70s hard blues rock band, like Grand Funk or Humble Pie. But there are tuneful tracks led by acoustic guitar, tracks with strings and tracks with multiple sections, one of which is Ravel's Bolero. I noticed one of the string lines must be the part sampled by Fatboy Slim for Right Here, Right Now. The James Gang on the 3 albums they made with Joe Walsh are probably more like The Who in their sell-out through to Who's Next phases, with just a touch of Dave Gilmour's spacey slide work from Floyd's Saucerful of Secrets era. I have a vague memory of the James Gang song Funk 49, which is indeed sort of funky for a hard rock band, and has a catchy call and response shouty chorus and a drum solo with cowbell. The other notable James Gang song is Walk Away, which is about as pop as early 70s hard rock ever got. The later James Gang songs are less hard rock and more tuneful, with big harmony backing vocals and a guest female singer. But always there is a lot of lead guitar solos, even on the one track that heavily features bluesy, jazzy, multi-tracked electric piano. I will definitely check out the full albums that Joe Walsh made with the James Gang and his solo records. However, nothing I've heard on this CD has made me want to ever listen to Hotel California. Joe Walsh, 1969 to 1974. Home of the Hits, the best of Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers. Some dormant part of me was electrically shocked into life when I first heard Springsteen shout, 1, 2, 3, 4, the highway's jammed with broken heroes on a last chance power drive. I worked in a bank in Uxbridge and it seemed often to come on the radio sometime after I hit the A40 at the Polish War Memorial. I was that broken hero. Then a year or so later, Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Roadrunner, Roadrunner, and I was doing faster miles an hour with the radio on. I had the single of Roadrunner, which had 2 versions. It was so good they made it twice. Apart from the very end, there was only 2 chords. Anyone could play it, and they did. I think I did, and I think the Sex Pistols also did. It didn't even need to be sung. It was like a spoken travelogue, but it was so catchy and a harbinger of what was to come. A friend of mine had the Modern Lovers album produced by John Cale, ex-Velvet Underground, and it sounded like Velvet Underground for the mid-70s. Richmond sings and writes songs like a nerdy Lou Reed, but with more humour. The Modern Lovers were from Boston, but John Cale made it New York cool. New York was the city of new bands that we were reading about, like Television, Blondie, and the Ramones. My friend also had the second and third albums. Richmond had moved away from the rawness to a cute softness. The guitars were cleaner and clearer, and everything was on a smaller scale. A bit like an East Coast Beach Boys. They had a hit with an instrumental called Egyptian Reggae, which sounds exactly like Egyptian Reggae, using a variation on that old Sandance tune made popular by Wilson Keppel and Betty. I saw him play at Hammersmith Odeon. I seem to remember it was advertised as the most fun you can have with your clothes on. It should have been a failure. It was announced that Jonathan did not like loud noise. The 4-piece band with small amps looked dwarfed on the stage. They were quiet, and so was the audience. I saw tough-looking men in leather jackets glowering at anyone making a noise. During the song I'm a Little Dinosaur, Richmond crawled around the stage, eliciting soft whoops of encouragement from the crowd, like it was a pantomime for the easily startled. They played a glorious little song called Morning of Our Lives, which made me buy the live album of that gig. I loved Morning of Our Lives back in the morning of my life, but I cannot now bring myself to listen to it. It is one of the strangest and most memorable gigs I have ever seen. I was transferred from the bank in Uxbridge to a branch in Hayes, where they had the account for Richmond's record company. And on the wall in the manager's office was a gold record for Egyptian Reggae. The best of Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers.
Big thank you to Twangling Jack Ford for this week's album reviews. You're listening to The Art Show on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain, and this is Dog All with Doc Cotton.
Serious music.
She's a matriarch with the red streaked hair, best service washing Albert Square. In the laundrette nearly every day, exclaims I shop with an
I say?
Friend of Jesus, don't you know, always got a fag on the go.
Doc Cotton! Doc Cotton! Doc Cotton! Doc!
Now Lost in half for nearly all her life, and most of there's been trouble and strife. She outlived husbands Charlie and Jim and her son Nick.
We don't like him.
If you smile at her, she might not smile back, cause it's hard to be happy when you say
Offside.
Duck hunt! Duck hunt! Duck
Blimey. Missed it.
Duck hunt!
Oh.
Duck hunt! Duck!
Offside. I'll do it next time. I'm a professional musician.
In 2884 episodes, Doc's a legend, she taught us loads. When your back's against the wall, stand proud in a blue checked overall. Doc can handle anything with a teacup of sherry and a super king. Doc hunt! Doc hunt! Doc hunt! Doc
Oh.
hunt! Na 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 na. Na 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 na.
It's a terrible sight when they're forming a line to watch you burn. Head, man off with his head. Let's find him a hole to fill in. In the dead of the night, the flames they will fly. What a glorious sight, a lesson well learned. I've been waiting my turn, and I'll be watching you burn, burn, burn. Watching you burn, burn, burn. Watching you burn, burn, burn. Watching you burn. Night, the ending is nigh, with no goodbyes to soothe you. Life, what a waste of a life. No tears or roses falling. In the dead of the night, the flames they will fly. What a glorious sight, a lesson well learned. I'm waiting my turn, and I'll be watching you burn, burn, burn. 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 I'll be watching you burn, burn, burn. Watching you burn, burn, burn. Watching you burn, burn, burn. I'll be watching you burn.
That was Lullaby for an Undeserving Than a Word That I Cannot Say on the Radio by Bert Honor. Before that we had Dot Cotton by Dog Ole. You're listening to The Archer on 106.6 FM Wickham Sound. I'm your host, Dane Cobain. This is the part of the show where we would normally head over to the Oak Shed to catch up with Twangling Jack Ford for a weekly album review, but obviously it has been a Twangling Jack album review special. So, I'll leave you with the other stuff instead. As always, reach out to me here at the studio on dane.cobain at wickhamsound.org.uk. That's dane.cobain at wickhamsound.org.uk. And I'm particularly keen to hear from poets, performers, musicians, people with MP3s, local arts news, etc. Don't hesitate to get in touch. You can also let me know of any announcements that you would like to be featured in our new series of announcements. You can find us on Facebook. If you search for The Art Show on Wickham Sound, you should be able to find us. And we are repeated on Wickham Sound on Monday nights. We're on the Wickham Sound Listen Again, iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Please do leave us a short review on your podcast platform of choice. So I'm going to leave you with one last tune, and this is Colin Upfield with Mona Lisa Smile. I'll catch you next week.
I could see, but they don't do the things you do to me. When you're hanging on the wall, the others might as well not be there at all. Though I know you're flawed in parts, to me you're a work of art. When I look into your eyes, it's like looking at the night sky. When I look into your face, greatest thing by miles is looking at your Mona Lisa smile. Looking at your Mona Lisa smile. I know we've had our ups and downs. I know at times I'm a pain to have around, but our love is strong enough to take the smooth with the rough. I know at times it seems that I don't care, but you're my world and I need you there. And when you give a smile that I adore, I see the timeless beauty that Leonardo saw. When I look into your eyes, it's like looking at the night sky. When I look into your face, it takes me to another place. But the greatest thing by miles is looking at your Mona Lisa. Looking at your Mona Lisa. Looking at your Mona Lisa smile. Looking at your Mona Lisa smile. When I look into your eyes, like looking at the night sky. When I look into your face, it takes me to another place. But the greatest thing by miles is looking at your Mona